Thanks very much, Jason, and thank you to you and your team for putting on such a sterling event today. I've been really enjoying all the discussion. It's been terrific. And congratulations to this very large crowd that is here. So thank you all for taking part in this. It's been super. Could I ask the panelists for this next group to come forward, and I will do very brief introductions because I think most of them are known to you already anyway. A couple of my colleagues here I had not seen yet this morning, so I was getting a little nervous, but I'm delighted everyone's here. I'm going to introduce a panel very, very briefly and invite them to, perhaps if they wish, to add a little more about their career and background as it's relevant as we go ahead in the discussion. But I'm just going to go from my immediate left and move further left. First of all, Bill Charnetski, who of course is well known to everyone. The program says that he was the first Chief Health Innovation Strategist for Ontario. He was also the last. He's the one and only. Bill is truly irreplaceable, right? So we're so delighted that he's here today. And to Bill's left is Tammy Moore, who is CEO of the ALS Society of Canada. Tammy is also currently chair of the Health Charities Coalition of Canada, and someone who I've got to know recently more and through the patient community, and delighted to have her as a colleague with us today. Next is Helen Stevenson, another person who you are all very familiar with. Of course, Helen has been engaged in her company, the Reformulary Group, for a number of years now, and prior to that, of course, has served in the Ontario government as Assistant Deputy Minister of Health and the first executive officer, the first but not the last, though, Helen, executive officer under the Ontario Public Drug Programs. And finally, Gamsi Yusland. Gamsi is a newcomer to Canada, having moved here earlier this year as the General Manager for Takeda Corporation here in Canada, following a period in a similar role in Turkey for a number of years before, where Gamsi is originally from. So Gamsi, welcome to Canada and to your first winter here, and welcome to everyone on the panel. So in our discussions beforehand, we talked about some of the ideas that we thought it would be useful to address today, and we keep coming back to the concept of value, and I know that came up a little bit, and certainly at the table that I was at this morning. So I'd like to lead off with asking you to share some thoughts about value. When we're talking about accessing products of the life sciences sector, they're not going to buy them just because they're innovative, right? They're going to buy them because they're useful, because they're valuable. But how do we assess value, and what does value-based healthcare mean? Bill, I'm going to start with you because I know you've thought a lot about this in your role and in your life.
In my life?
Yeah.
My life is really boring.
That was giving you a chance to go back and talk about your days at AZ and the law firm.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like we were working on some of this stuff together. So we talked a little bit in advance of what people will say, so I get the luxury of not having to take on a couple of the tougher questions, like what actually are the components of value. But what I will kick things off by saying is, the previous panel and everyone now is talking about value-based procurement, it feels like. And it's value-based procurement in support of value-based care. So I guess that's where I'd like to take the conversation. If we are going to have a sustainable health system, and it's not sustainable as it's currently constructed given the demographic pressures ahead of us, we need to find a different way to not just deliver beds and staffing, but have innovation an integral part of the offering. And that dovetails with, it is not inconsistent with, in fact, it's mutually supportive with the whole topic of conversation in the last panel, namely health as an economic driver. So for 3 years, I've said over and over again, health is an economic driver. I will say that even no longer in the job because it's just so important to this province. But both those components take you to a place of needing to execute a value-based care strategy. And Porter and Kaplan, many of you will be familiar with it, you know, their formula is pretty straightforward, right? If you're actually looking at the creation of value in a health system, you're looking at patient outcomes, but real patient outcomes, not measures that are proxies for patient outcomes. Real patient outcomes in relation to the real cost of delivering healthcare through the whole patient journey. And again, not reimbursable costs. Grant Gunn and I were reminded of a conversation years ago at an OCC economic summit where George Smitherman had heard somebody had just gotten a bill for services delivered because they'd just been in the province for less than 6 months, and he was minister at the time, and he quite honestly said, well, what I know about that bill is it bore no resemblance to the cost of the actual delivery of services to that person. I don't think it's changed. So if we get to a place where the system is looking at value-based care, like how it's actually creating value for patients in the system, then we'll start to make an appropriate and optimal allocation of resources. Value-based procurement is simply one aspect of working within that system. And that value-based procurement model is not new. We're not cutting edge in Ontario. It's now talked about much more frequently in Ontario, and I love that that's lasted longer than I did in the role, because it's so critically important that we get past looking at cost as the sole or principal determinant of the purchases that we're making, whether it's goods, services, processes, or technology. That is, above all else, where we need to go with value in our system. I'll stop, because then the harder questions, which I think others will talk about, is, okay, well, that's all well and good. So you're saying there's two columns, cost and value. Well, what's in the value column? And there's lots of examples that European nations who now have been subject for some time to European directive on value-based procurement have used to good effect. And we can have that conversation.
Tammy, can I turn to you then, and thinking from a patient perspective, and I think in particular of the patients that you represent who've been waiting a long time for effective treatment. What is value to you? What is value to them?
Thanks, Wayne. So for those of you who don't know, ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease, and in 2 to 5 years, somebody can go from being completely able-bodied to completely disabled and would lose their fight potentially in their ability to breathe. And we're just seeing the second therapy in 20 years to be potentially coming to market. And so now we're into an interesting conversation, and it really thrust us in. We kept seeing it coming, but when it was approved by the FDA in May of 2017, it suddenly meant that our population was trying to access this therapy. Well, we worked with the company to be able to have them apply for Health Canada approval. And of course, now we're in the CADTH and PMPRB discussions around what is the value of this drug. And you can appreciate that if you were given this diagnosis, the value of extending your life would be worth anything. And so for our population, they are wrestling with what is the value of it and how do we look at it. But I think I've been feeling very much like I've been on a soapbox lately saying, and I was pleased to hear them talking about in the last panel, about the systems-based approach. Because I think if we look at some of these innovations in isolation, in the silos, we lose the overall understanding of the value across the spectrum. So if we think about healthcare only delivered in a hospital, well, that doesn't actually represent the bulk of the healthcare that my population would need. So an innovation like this therapy, while on the books it might look expensive, and we don't yet know what that cost is, when we consider that that will allow somebody to maintain their independence longer, that it could extend their life expectancy up to 30%, that this much finger movement, being able to maintain that means their independence because they can still control their wheelchair and their environment to some degree. So value from a patient perspective is very personal, and it's something that we really have to give some consideration to.
That's really important. I just find it's always so. We're going to come back and talk about the role of patients in innovation and healthcare generally. So we'll be able to pick that up. But I'm always so moved by the stories of patients whose lives are changed by things that many people would not even recognize as being of value. And so that voice is so important to hear. Helen, I know you, in your experience in the government, you had to deal a lot with both patient organizations and manufacturers bringing new innovations to market. You're kind of on the other side a little bit now because you're innovative in your own business. So you've seen things from both sides. How do you see the value as both as a purchaser and the value as a supplier into the system?
Yeah, and beware, I won't be able to resist to say something about National Pharmacare, but I will keep it short. So value-based healthcare, certainly in my mind and where I currently sit, is really related to outcomes-based healthcare. And I do think there's a big opportunity, but I also think there's a big gap as it relates to the way we measure outcomes and how we measure. You take outcomes, for instance, and incorporate that in our decisions and in our direction. While National Pharmacare certainly is going to, well, at least the prospect of it could fill the gap in terms of coverage for people, I think it won't come anywhere near filling the gap, again, with respect to outcomes-based care and really being able to measure that. So areas, I think, such as rare diseases, for instance, could really benefit from outcomes-based healthcare, especially if it's done on a national scale. I know I actually put in a submission to the Advisory Council on Pharmacare about that specific area because I think that is an area where not only certainly in my experience in government do people actually move provinces to get better coverage, if there is better coverage, but it is an area where we have limited data, and to the extent we actually could have outcomes-based data, that could be really powerful in terms of future directions. I do think there's really little done right now. I'm sort of surprised and certainly try to forge ahead in the work that we're doing, but really to capture those real-world outcomes, both patient-reported and aggregated. I know there's a suggestion sometimes that patient-reported data is too subjective, but I would actually disagree with that. I think there are really valuable tools in the market whereby patient-reported outcomes can be incorporating clinically meaningful data. So just a couple of comments again about Pharmacare. So it is absolutely true we have a patchwork. We have a patchwork of public and private plans, and there are some people that don't have coverage, and there are some people who have coverage of everything no matter how much it costs and whether it even works. So we do have this real dilemma, I would say. Coverage, some people don't have it because of choice, some people don't have it because they don't have access to it. But what I did want to mention is I saw a study by Polera, actually, that was published in August of this year, 4,000 Canadians, and it was certainly skewed towards Pharmacare and really understanding people's views around it. And what I thought was really interesting is actually the Canadians put healthcare generally, not Pharmacare and not coverage and not universal coverage, as actually the most important top-of-mind issue. And so I think that is a particular important point to take from it, and certainly in view of the previous panel. And so just a quick, one really quick sidebar comment to that, and I just wanted to put it out there, as an idea too, where I think, again, outcomes can go. So in my organization, we have a very large data asset. So we have data for about 1.3 billion records for 12 million Canadians. And so what we actually did is we looked at people, for instance, with type 2 diabetes that had very high compounding costs. So we're looking at the drug costs. But what was so interesting is we actually then used clinical algorithms, we applied machine learning, and we did some other, brought in some other data. And what we found, I hope you find it interesting, I certainly did, was that the high proportion of patients that had high drug costs lived in Scarborough, had large households, didn't have any pets, and didn't have any gyms in their neighborhood. So when you think of that and match it with healthcare generally, in my mind, right, the real opportunity to deliver care is more around healthcare. So how can we, and it seems to me, some pretty innovative ideas that would be very low cost are, then give people access, for instance, to physical exercise, put phys ed coaches or whatever in neighborhoods. And so anyway, it's some of the, I would say, on a basic level around using that kind of data and being able to really drive. So where could there be some innovations that actually can make some incremental difference?
Helen, you were worried that people wouldn't be interested in the detail, but you're dealing with a bunch of health policy nerds. we're all eating it up. That was great. That was very insightful. And no, thank you very much for sharing that. Gamze, you bring a different perspective to this table because you're a global manufacturer. You represent a global manufacturer. Obviously, discussions about value, challenges in procurement and access, market access are everywhere in the world, not just in this country. As a global company, how does your company think about value in terms of how it develops and then markets its products?
So thank you, first of all, inviting me here as a newcomer to Canada. So this is a great country with great people, so the very good experience, 8 months. And it is a great question, and this question is being asked for a long time. You know, I'm in pharma industry more than 20 years, and I worked in Europe and Turkey, mostly in Europe and Turkey. And now I'm working in a Japanese global company. We have a kind of Japanese culture in our blood as well. So for so many years, this is a top topic, and we are really trying to define what really value is and what we should do as a global company to understand. And one of the important challenges that we have in front of us, we think that the value definition is not the same for each and every stakeholder. So we do not have a common understanding of value, which is a big challenge, in fact, because everybody is looking at from their own perspective to the value. But what we are doing, so what we are thinking as of today is that RWE, the real-world evidence, is the key to create value. So this is all about it right now in Takeda. This is what I can tell you. And we are spending lots of time and efforts to really think of how we can demonstrate value for our products throughout the life cycle, not just not at the launch stage. And Canada, Takeda defined Canada is one of the hub, one of the center of excellence for this value demonstration, RWE studies. And what we are also trying to do, engage patients and any type of stakeholders, in fact, but patients as early as possible to any type of study that we are going to think of. But really, I can tell you, if I want to say one sentence, it is all about RWE for us. And at the same time, really partner with each and every stakeholder and try to understand their perspective and try to create a common understanding. So this is what I can tell you as a summary.
No, that's really helpful. I made a note, in fact. I don't think we've talked too much about real-world evidence today, and yet that's clearly really important for this topic and this discussion. So thank you. That's super. I want to change channels a little bit here. When we're talking about access to health innovation in this country, we have to think about all the various systems and processes that people identified earlier on, and especially in some of the table discussions. Some of the ideas were about breaking down silos and more cross working together. But we do have a lot of different aspects. And we are seeing innovation across the system in different ways. Most of it good, some of it perhaps not so good. I'd like to touch on some of those and ask for your response to them. Now, when we had our little pre-conference telephone chat, we identified a number of them. So I'm just going to list them off. I'm not going to suggest we go through them one by one, but please feel free to respond to or comment on any of these. So things that we identified as being some of the major changes: the regulatory modernization process at Health Canada, which I think is fairly significant. I think we're starting to see some action. We already have seen concrete steps to introduce an aligned process between Health Canada and CADTH to speed up the time to listing for drugs. A long way to go, obviously, it's just started. But even the conversation is changing. Is our Deputy Minister of Red Tape Reduction still here? I was so pleased to hear him say that he thought the idea of aligning Health Canada and FDA made sense. We should move him to Ottawa, right? What do you think? But there is movement, is the point that I'm trying to make. CADTH is trying to put more focus on health technology management. So not just assessment at the time of decision to cover or acquire, but management throughout the life cycle of a product. Helen's already raised the question of national pharmacare. It's a very important, huge, disruptive discussion that's going on now and is going to be very important over the next year. One thing we didn't list, and I'm not sure why, we didn't mention pricing reform for pharmaceuticals and PMPRB reform. Hugely disruptive and something that obviously impacts the life sciences sector. So with that kind of framework, I'll pick whoever wants to go first. To what extent do some of these proposals create real opportunities for the life sciences sector to advance towards all those strategies and goals that Jason is going to work on after today? Anyone want to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Thanks, Helen.
So I think for the life sciences sector, and actually I will challenge you, because we've certainly tried to do it with a couple of organizations, but I do think this idea of real-world evidence and outcomes, I think there's an appetite for it from the public payers, for instance, but it is a bit of a risk for yourselves because it may well be that your drugs or devices or technologies, for instance, actually don't deliver the kind of outcomes that may be speculated, but I actually think there's a big appetite right now or opportunity to be able to do that and to test the waters somewhat and to look at sort of outcomes-based evidence. I mean, I'm looking at Sarah because of Novartis, right? Most people in the room read about their $4.5 million gene therapy, right, for spinal muscular atrophy. And, it sort of represents a lot of different issues. But if we actually knew, and as a payer, a public payer I was, and in some ways as a private payer now, if we actually knew that it delivered the outcomes that we believe in either smaller clinical trials or, in sort of early days, maybe there'd be a possibility that these kinds of therapies would be funded. I'm sure they'd still try to negotiate the price, but I just think we haven't, I would say respectfully to everybody, we haven't done that very well. And I think now would be a good time to test the waters with payers, to use organizations that can take the data, that can agree up front in terms of what are the parameters we're measuring, then have it happen, and then let's come back at it. And there's going to be some financial terms in there or not, or other terms. But I think I'd say the time is really now to embrace that and test it out. So I challenge you. I'd be happy to help. We'd be happy to help.
Well, that's great to have some challenges out there. Bill, do you have any either challenges to throw out there or some experiences to share from your work? I know you were trying to break down silos, and what are some of the challenges there and opportunities that we may not have thought about?
Yeah, so I attributed this to my mother, but now I think that somebody else said it before my mother. But the line was, nothing's expensive if it's worth it. And I think, so that's to me the heart of the question of what is value. So stakeholders will have a different view on value. I wish that the health systems would be able to articulate with crispness what their priorities are and the things for which they're really looking for solutions, whether it's biopharmaceutical or devices or processes, because then you would actually be able to have the discussion about whether the solution that's being provided, answering a priority, is worth it. It still will beg that point I made earlier. We don't know how much things cost. We know how much they might be reimbursed at. We might know, a lot of different things, but there's great examples of how even systems that just rely on management accounting, so cost allocation, will get you to the wrong conclusion. So a hospital thought, the worst performing group in our system was the physiotherapy unit, and we really should cut back on physiotherapy, until they realized that their costs are being allocated on a square footage basis. Well, guess what? Physiotherapy side is this big, the operating room is this big. You actually look at how much things really do cost, and you find out in that circumstance that the physiotherapy unit was the most profitable. So we really need precision, and that will get you to data and data analytics, which, again, we don't have in the system. But that sounds really negative and depressing. I think that, but that is the ultimate challenge, right? Like, it's all well and good to talk about value. We don't know how much things cost, so we don't prioritize, and then we don't know how much things cost. So it's not even a high bar. It's a kind of a non-existent bar when solutions are brought forward, unless you have that in the environment. Having said that, the folks at CAHO have started to do some really strong work identifying what priorities for their 23 hospitals are. And if there's something to leave with everybody in the room, whether you're a health service provider or the companies, if you're a health service provider, please work hard on identifying your priorities. If you're the manufacturer or the company, address the priorities, because that's actually how you'll get the deals done, and then we can talk about how much value should be, and then start to negotiate. The other thing, just to say it, it's a whole topic on itself, is we are in an environment in different disciplines in different countries on risk sharing. So risk sharing and ultimately gain sharing, and we started to do that. I'm sure the government will come back around to it at some point, and they're doing it in pharmaceuticals in Europe. I think people in places like Catalonia and others, where they're doing it in a big way. But the notion ultimately of, all right, so we'll pay for stuff that works, but you, manufacturer, have to share some of that risk with us. And I bet Helen was thinking about it back in the day, but I really wish that would evolve. That will depend on having the capabilities in the government to negotiate such things. But if you can get there, then you start going down a path of paying for things that are worth it, and get away from this notion of X thousand or million is expensive or not.
From a manufacturer perspective, Gamzee, are manufacturers interested in risk sharing? Has your company had experience in Europe where it's a little more prevalent than here?
Yeah, there are some experiences. Europe, this is more popular in Europe in some different countries, so we are having some experiences there. And it is really depending on the government strategies, the policies, procedures, the data that you have, expectations of the stakeholders, the insurers. So it is working. So in some countries, it is definitely working. Risk sharing is one thing important. And coming back to your question, you were asking about the initiatives that CADIT and Healthcare Canada is taking. And there's, as far as I understand, there is a kind of streamlining, simplification process started to make things easier, because I think this is such a complex environment to make things easier. I think this is a good initiative. One thing maybe for value can be interesting, this is what we thought as Takeda, this CADIT's early scientific advice program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think this is a very good program. We started to be part of the program. So it is really making, as a manufacturer, at the very, very beginning, at the early development stage, you have a chance, you go and talk to HTA bodies, and you get their insights and inputs about the value, even before starting to design the clinical study. So this is, for example, something really good, and I think this can be a good thing for the future. So I think it's a very good initiative. So we had one experience, it started well. So I thought this could be a good example to put the value and environment all together. It is very early, but I think it can be something good.
So some of these changes that we're seeing really do provide opportunities.
Yeah, I think it may be an opportunity.
And,
I think we need to think about it as well as
how
manufacturers, how we can use this type of environment or
best
this
to act
type of
on it.
opportunities in a better way.
We all know that they did not come easy.
Exactly.
A lot of these things were talked about for a long time, and they're still in very early stages, but they need support.
It may work.
And they need work. Tammy, you're looking at this landscape. You're wearing two hats, really, because you have the ALS Society hat, but the coalition as a whole has a much bigger hat. What's your perspective on some of these major changes going on in the regulatory and reimbursement environment?
Yes. I think first I'd like to actually comment on what Bill had said about measuring the inputs into the healthcare system, and actually wearing my Health Charities hat would suggest that I don't think that all of those measurements are being measured. So I look at what the health charity sector as a whole in Canada is contributing, both in terms of the research dollars that we're putting in terms of the patient supports that we have in place. Again, at ALS Canada, we're buying hospital beds and wheelchairs and ceiling lifts because our healthcare system doesn't provide those for our population. Muscular dystrophy sees similar things. And so if we don't measure those inputs, then again, our square footage might look quite different, but in fact, that's really not the cost of it. So it's really important that we give that consideration. And I know I was at a presentation with Dr. Devlin, and again, as he was talking about the system, I challenged him to please make sure that he was considering all of the system costs, not just the ones that he was paying for directly. I'm hoping that he heard that, but we'll see. So when we think about the other changes that are happening, I think some concerns that we have are how will some of these changes actually create an environment in Canada or not that makes new and innovative therapies coming to market a possibility in Canada. And I know there's some significant concern around some of the PMPRB legislation changes or regulation changes that are significant concerns in terms of the countries that are being considered in the pricing index. And if these aren't considered appropriately, then do we actually shut the door in Canada and have companies just simply turn away and not consider it? And I know, again, from my experience with ALS, when we have the drug available across the border, a generic available in Japan, and then we can't get it into the hands of our population here in Canada, it's a really, it doubles down on the devastation of it. And I think we are at great risk in Canada if we don't take careful consideration to the implication of what this is in the future. And Helen, to your comments on National Pharmacare, I'm a bit concerned, actually. I'm kind of wondering if National Pharmacare, as we've been talking about in some of the engagements that I've had, is trying to solve today's problem with National Pharmacare. And is it really looking far enough out at what the real issues are going to be in 5 and 10 years? Because I think as we get down to a place where disease is understood to a greater place and we have more precision medicine, these costs will be higher per person, but overall will there be that cost and that way of managing that? And I'm thinking about it, as well, we're a health charity, we are a business, and so I'm wearing that hat too, thinking how will we cope in an employer type situation where we're providing benefits to people and we have somebody that's on one of these very costly drugs, and if it's bearing it only on my small population of employees, what will happen to our benefits and our ability to provide for the future? So I really think we need to be looking far down the range on these.
That's that's an important comment. We need to be building systems for the future, not building systems for the past, or rebuilding systems from the past. So that's the other thing I take away from your comments, of course, too, is the necessity of being aware of the unintended consequences and taking account of unintended consequences of any policy steps. Bill, we're going to have to move on from this topic, but I did just want to pick up on your reference to risk sharing and the need to engage in more risk sharing approaches in this country, and that cuts across everything in the life sciences sector. And we've had a lot of false starts, I think, on that over the years. There is a new initiative, and I'm sure everyone is following it, the new initiative coming out of 3 provinces heading up the expensive drugs for rare diseases study for the provincial drug plans. Consultations just started, underway now, being facilitated by CADIF, but looking at how to actually implement risk-sharing type approaches in order to facilitate access to the more expensive new high-tech therapies, especially drugs for rare diseases. So an opportunity, hopefully, for our sector to step up and to try and participate in and help make that kind of an approach and that system work. So any experiences that people have will all be beneficial in that. Sorry, a little editorial. I just couldn't resist. One of the things I want to come back to that Tammy touched on earlier is the role of patients. I think it really is important for us to take into account, even getting on the question of value and assessing value. We need to know patients' perceptions of value, not just the payers' perceptions of value. But the role of patients throughout the development, the research and development process, I'd like to get your thoughts around the table on that one. Tammy, I'm looking at you maybe as a logical place to start, but please, anybody else too.
Absolutely. I think right early on, when you mentioned research, many of our organizations at HCCC would actually have patients even involved in the peer review of our very basic research programs as well. But patients involved throughout that process, both in the clinical trials and how those are structured, how they can get access to those very important trials, what that means in terms of a drug potentially coming to market in Canada, and then throughout the process. So again, when we think about CADITH and PMPRB, how is the patient voice coming forward? And I think what is the transparency thereafter? And that's a very big concern for our communities in terms of how do they hear back about what's going on. And I think it is important too to not be too paternalistic with patients, and to make sure that they are engaged in real conversations up front. You know, we talk about how do we get patients on therapies, but sometimes we have to have agreements up front about how we will have them come off therapies too, and when is the right time. But if you've engaged them in that process, it can be a much better conversation than if simply you're trying to remove the therapy later on. So patient, not just in terms of tokenism, but in a real and meaningful engagement is a really critical piece of it.
I can't resist sharing the story. I was at an event the other day, and a question was put out to, just like the tables that we had earlier, a question was put out to fit in. The question started off with, your physician is the primary decision maker, and the patient sitting beside me grabbed her pen and she said, no, she's not. We are co-decision makers. We're in this together. And I thought that was an important message to share. Gamsi?
I can say a few things. As Takeda, we are a Japanese company, I told you, and we are living for 237 years, and with the same values. And number one thing is patient for us. And so we are living really for the patients. We are existing for the patients. And we have a special formula for any type of decision we make. We put the patient first, and then trust comes, and then reputation, and then business. So that's why, as a company, culturally, we value patient really a lot. We really care about patients. So that's why we are really trying to put the patients into any type of decisions that we give. And we believe that we need to improve this. So what I mean is we would like to involve patients as much as we can, as early as possible, even before designing a clinical study. Now we are seeing with them, our R&D department is working really very closely with the patients, getting their input even before starting the clinical study, before designing a clinical study. For example, this is, I think, important. Listening to the patients, having advisory boards, just to hear them, I mean, understand them, what they feel, how they feel, not only the outcomes, not only the hardcore scientific results, but their feelings, their emotions, their journey, disease journey. But those are really important things for us. And we believe that as long as we understand more and more, I think we can really talk about the value. I think the real value, we have been talking about it. In fact, the value is about the patient, what our products does to the patient's life. I mean, emotionally and also, I mean, from the biologic point of view. So this is how we see the patient in our company.
Super. Helen?
Yeah, I'd be happy. Just two quick comments. One is to Tammy's point, and just a bit of sort of historical reference. So when I was in government, we actually did, we had a program for a drug called Elaprase for Hunter syndrome that some of you may or may not know. But we actually did a lot of work because that drug, I can say by any account, is not cost effective. It's about $1 million per person per year. And there were very few people who had used it, at least in Canada, and so we created an opportunity to be able to have an approach towards it where we could cover people where we thought there was a high probability of good outcomes. Anyway, one of the key things we did, and I think that would be an important piece, I would really highlight what Tammy had to say, is we actually had not quite a written agreement, but we had a verbal agreement with patients with respect to where the drug had to be infused. Some wanted it at home, and there was no way we were going to allow that because of the sensitivity, the reactions, et cetera. But number two, even more importantly, was around the going on and coming off. And so there was, again, more of a verbal agreement around being able to come off. But I will say that kind of being able to do, but having that kind of approach, it enabled us to cover a drug where, like, CADITH wasn't recommending it. So we were really the only ones in Ontario that decided to be able, or felt we could move forward on that basis. So I just wanted to share that little piece of history. And then if I can actually just take you out of your box and give you one quick example about patients, because it's totally different. I mentioned it again to Sarah. So we've now spent the last, 5 months deep in medical cannabis and building a medical cannabis formulary. Because as you probably know, it's the Wild West out there, and there is actually some good quality evidence by high standards for certain, not many, but certain indications. And so one of the important parts of us is also in building that is creating a platform for patients to be able to self-report their outcomes. And not from the perspective, I mean, I think what's important is patient reporting needs to be based on, again, clinical metrics that actually we can interpret in terms of how people are benefiting in their clinical outcomes, rather than just saying, I feel good today, or I feel tired, or I feel giggly, or whatever, because that kind of patient reporting outcomes isn't really going to help us build a base of evidence. So I would suggest, notwithstanding that it's an area that maybe only a couple of people in the room are really familiar of, but there are, I think, opportunities to be able to create platforms to capture that kind of patient and turn it into sort of patient-based evidence, which I think is equally as important in terms of feeding it back into what we know to be the more traditional clinical trial kind of evidence.
Great, thank you very much. Bill, I know that is in your role as health innovation strategist, you consulted patients. You worked hard at that, I know. What were some of the lessons you learned from that exercise? Because it's not all roses, right? It's not the easiest thing to do. We all say consult patients, but how do you actually do it, and how do you get meaningful results you can work with and act on?
So I learned about customer centricity when I went to AstraZeneca Canada, where the new CEO really brought that to the organization. So you will all, this is now 10 years old, right? So, but I saw how, frankly, people lost their jobs, right? Because lifers in pharma couldn't get their heads around the notion that if you're truly customer-centric, it is a very different place to live than pushing, right? Doesn't mean customers are always right. You shape your customer. However, to look at things from their vantage point is very, very different. Apple has its version of user centricity. Our health system says it's patient-centric. Spent a lot of time with colleagues at the Ministry of Health helping them understand how different it is to be truly patient-centric. And it's not always a comfortable place to be, because you know what? They're going to have different views than anyone does as a provider, whether it's commercial or health. And so the thing that was most striking to me is we were lucky to have a woman called Julie Drury as the head of, I guess she still is the head of our Ontario's Patient and Family Advisory Council. And she was bringing patient stories to the executive table, so you'd sort of expect her to do that. But she's super smart, super capable, and she wasn't just doing it to tug heartstrings. I mean, honestly, most of us are crying at some point along the patient's journey anyway. But the thing that shows you the value of patient centricity is these are 4 very different situations. And the one thing that was common across all 4 of them is when you're hearing from the patient's perspective, so you're truly in the patient's shoes, the commonality lied in the lack of e-consult as much as anything else, but certainly the ability to electronically communicate with the GP specialists, across specialists, and back to the patient, because that was adding, in each one of the 4 cases, months to the patient journey. These anecdotes that we've all had that get dismissed, everyone nods, and then frankly, often nothing happens. If you are truly patient-centric in your system, then you realize that this, as much as anything else, is the cause of inefficiency, lower outcomes, patient dissatisfaction, and an underperforming system. Just this continuing situation where if another specialist office doesn't answer the phone or their voicemail or a fax from the referring physician is just kind of madness. But it's only the most kind of obvious example to me of the system that is different if it's patient-centric. Because there's we were talking about the components of value. There's examples in countries like in Norway and others in Europe where if you include in that list of value components things like patient satisfaction, patient discomfort, ease of administration, you will get often, so the manufacturers in the room, you will often get to the higher priced good or service being provided, but not for the wrong reasons, it'll be for the right reasons, because there will be a reduction of costs as well as just, the soft measurement of patient satisfaction often translates into lower readmission, lower drug consumption. And so if you have an integrated health approach looking across those silos and you're truly patient-centric, now you've got a system that starts to look more like those truly high-performing organizations that we see elsewhere in the world.
That's a perfect lead into the next area I wanted to get into, Bill. And maybe if I could just give a heads up to the crowd. In a few minutes, we'll stop and we're going to turn things over and invite questions from the floor. So please start thinking about any questions or points or comments you'd like to make on this broad topic. But just picking up, Bill, on where you ended up there. One of the challenges, and this is something we'll assign Jason this job to do over the next year, put it on his list. But one of the challenges that all innovative companies have in this space is to not just demonstrate the value of their product and the worth of their product, but also to demonstrate how it's efficient in the system, how it can help save healthcare costs, makes the system more efficient, provide greater satisfaction in terms of the patient and physicians and whatnot. What are some ways that Life Sciences Ontario might be able to support you in making those kinds of submissions and representations to payers and funders in the system? Is it fair to come back to you, Bill, on that, or should I give you a rest? Helen, you were on the end of receiving some of those submissions. What, maybe tell us things not to do.
Well, I would say probably the best, let's say, submissions I ever got were ones that actually provided really practical solutions. Yeah. So I will say, and now I'm sitting on the other side, it's very tempting to criticize government and process and the people and et cetera, but I will also say that, right, for the most part, as did I, you have a mandate and you're there to deliver on your mandate, and you don't really get to, right, you don't have you have some flexibility, et cetera, but to the extent those organizations could come in and actually give a really practical solution, like number first, second, third, et cetera, it goes a long way. And I'll tell you why. It's not because, I think very highly of, there are a lot of real superstars in the bureaucracy. Certainly there's a mix too, but for the most part, when you get to people in more senior roles, and Bill, you probably have a comment too, is that you're torn in so many different directions, including by the politicians, including by the ombudsman in my case. I used to be on his speed dial phone at the time, but that you don't always have time to sort of stand back. And so when companies come in with great ideas, sort of conceptually, like let's take the idea of risk sharing or real-world evident outcomes-based agreements, it's really hard in a senior role to be able to dedicate the time to kind of figure out, okay, so how does that roll out? So my best advice would be go in with the plan already mocked up or already made out. There's going to be deviations for sure, and don't feel badly about it, but to the extent you can actually give that to someone, a well-thought-out plan, and flexibility to be able to change it, I would say it is really, really valuable. And I know when I was there, it was so valuable to be able to have that and to work from that, right? It's always easier to edit than it is to actually take a blank piece of paper.
So what she said, it's spot on, and you heard it this morning too from the very first panel. You heard other things as well, but be solution-oriented. It is a cliche, but like most cliches, it's true. And there are days, I don't know how colleagues around that executive team actually were able to keep up with things. And the reality is that you can't really, right? When you're that busy, all you're doing is putting fingers in the holes in the dike, right? So anything that helps them do their job is really welcome. The thing I will add is evidence. So every small company, scale up or multinationals, it's interesting how big sophisticated companies kind of miss this sometimes too, not because they weren't smart enough, it's just they were in different priorities. Evidence. So the system has to be evidence-based. I have a view that, I better be careful, I won't say what my view is, but you can't be a slave to evidence, right? You can't get to a place where the hurdle for every decision is such that it makes it too hard to adopt, which is kind of where we're at. Like that, someone talked about this earlier, there's a real status quo bias in the system. So it's some version of, it's generally okay and fine, and here are the hurdles to do anything differently or do different things. So in the moment, you might make the right decision. But when that decision is made over and over and over again, at the end of the day, you don't have the adoption of incremental innovation, and you actually haven't changed the system, because in every time the answer is kind of no. And that's a very dangerous place to live. But the folks are evidence-based, just like physicians are evidence-based generally. So whether it's, like pharma is one thing, because usually you're subject to certain requirements, but on the device side, like have some evidence. It's not just good enough to think that it's a bright, shiny bauble that you and your family and friends and even a couple of investors thinks is cool. There's too many opportunity costs to any investment decision from the health side. So come forward with some evidence that shows that it works somewhere. And if you put, then the third piece I will say is know as best as you can what the priorities of the system are and address them. So if you're coming forward now with a solution that's addressing a priority problem with evidence to support it, that is a meeting that people like Helen and I would have been really interested in taking. We'll take all of them, but you got our interest in that one.
Gamsey, anything to add from a manufacturer perspective? I don't want you to share competitive secrets here, right?
It all makes sense. I mean, what I heard, and this is exactly what we are trying to do. I think we need to find a way to continue to demonstrate that by evidence, with support of evidence, the products are working as well. Maybe innovative products are helping us to save some money at a stage. And I think we need to find a way, and we need to continue to work on it to show to the authorities or to all of the stakeholders that we can save money with innovative drugs as long as we use the drugs for the right patient at the right time. I think this is what we should continue to focus on, producing evidence and definitely creating the right story, making it as simple as possible. I mean, finding solutions to the priorities, to the real problems, so really understanding the environment. I think those are really the priorities for my company as well.
Tammy?
And if I could add, bring the patient voice to the conversation as well. I think it goes without saying, but it does bring that real experience and can make those stories that much more profound.
And presumably, in some cases, Bill, look at coverage with evidence development, whether we're talking about devices or medication, but get agreement among the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders, physicians, patients, and researchers, to perhaps provide coverage pending further development of research, that an agreement on the stop and start criteria, et cetera, as we go along.
Yeah, that's the magic wand, right? Like, if you had the system identify the priorities, and you, just like you do a commercial deal, right? So billions of dollars trade hands on the back of, here's where we think it's going to go. We're going to agree on the milestones. If it exceeds the milestones, we'll buy it, or we'll pay you. If it doesn't, we won't. And if I had the magic wand, that's what I would do to the whole health system.
Well, you got nothing else to do now, so why don't you figure that out?
Because you can agree on the milestones. Like we could sit down and pick a couple of priority areas, whether you're talking about devices or pharma. Use outcome-based procurement, as Helen was talking about. So here's my best example going, which was, and I think they're going to end up doing this, long-term care. Two biggest problems in long-term care are reduction of harmful falls and medication management. And it's a big problem for the system because, grandpa falls, breaks a hip, in they go for 8 days into the hospital. And that's hallway medicine, that's capacity management, that's all that kind of stuff. So talk about, and so the people will, in the ministry lament, quite rightly, we've taken a couple of cracks at reduction of harmful falls. People say they can do things, and then nothing really changes. So it's a perfect place for outcome-based procurement. Like, we will reduce harmful falls in these places by this percentage by this time. And then you structure the commercial deal, the purchase, on the back of those criteria. And then you manage the risk, you share the risk, and if we're really sophisticated about it, you could even share the gain, which would be attractive for everyone. And that, I'd love to see that. And you could do it on med management in the same way.
Great, that's really, really helpful. No shortage of good ideas here, and clearly of opportunities. Are there any questions or comments from anybody out here? Jason?
So thank you to all the panelists. That was terrific. My question's probably directed more so at Bill and Helen, given your experiences in government. One of the things I wonder about how we approach value-based procurement is working within the structure and processes within government and how they may need to change or adapt to that approach. So one of the examples would be when we look at cost savings. Do we look at it through strictly the lens of the healthcare system, or do we have mechanisms by which to assess value outside of the health system? So for example, medications or devices that could take people off of social assistance, improve productivity. We heard earlier in the panel about supporting Made in Ontario innovations, being first customers for Canadian innovators and Ontario innovators. So are there mechanisms in place in government to assess value through those lenses? And if not, how do we get them?
So it's a challenge, right? It's going to be a challenge even just to measure value across the silos of the health system, let alone, you know, outside the health system. But I mean, we'll see what happens, but my bet is integrated care delivery models has legs with the new government. We'll see if I'm right. It just feels like that's going forward. If that happens, you're starting now to work. You would start to work across those silos. You know, so best examples going are you reduce reduce errors in the operating room or other costs associated with ramifications of operations. Well, that might reduce readmissions or drug consumption, but the people making the investment decision for the operating room, it doesn't matter to them. Like, they're not accruing those benefits. So, but as you get to an integrated approach, you start to look across those silos, which is really important. I would love to, like, I was at a McKinsey thing somewhere a while ago and said something like, if you had one wish, what would you do? And I was in one of those moods and I said, you know, honestly, it would be amazing to reorganize governments around, for example, you know, like the Ministry of Obesity or something like that, right? The Ministry of Diabetes Prevention. Because if you did that, well, now you'd start to design your, like you'd have more walking, you'd have better urban development, you have more parks and recreation, you might have a local community physical, you know, phys ed or health advisor. Like, I actually think that's one of those ideas that they're starting, well, I know that's one of those ideas that they're showing in different places of the world has real benefit. Like, you give people coaches and they use them, the benefits are kind of ridiculous. It's one of those things we can't get our heads around. Anyway, I think that anything that looks across the integrated, you know, here people have suggested alignment across ministries. That's really what's behind your question. The other thing, you know, again, on the value component, if I had another year in the job, I would have hoped that we could have government say, health is an economic driver, and, you know, the helping scale up companies is a strategic priority right from the top on down. Because that's the other thing that's behind your question, right? In order to drive the behavioral change necessary, you need to have the statement at the very top, and then everybody in the chain starts to ask themselves how, and instead of, you know, saying, well, we can't do this, right? So I hope at some point that health as an economic driver is a knee-jerk reaction of everyone up and down and throughout the government involved in the health system, and that you then start to have, people will naturally then start to look across ministries and start to look at the different outcomes associated with it.
So I'm happy to offer something too. I have a suggestion, but first, sort of to answer the direct question, and probably some people have heard me say this before, but it is like in the drug program, you can't give credit to companies for economic development, right? Like, that's really what the Ministry of Economic Development is for, not the drug program. But my suggestion is try the private sector. And so let me give you a couple of really quick examples. So I know, again, we've done research in terms of drugs as a predictor of disability. So disability, as you probably know, for employers is one of their largest costs, right, and expenses. And so if we can actually understand how drugs, right, can be a predictor of disability, which, by the way, they can, because we've done the work, But certain tackling, for instance, some of those issues and doing it in, let's say, the private sector and taking that back to the public sector. Because part of the problem in the public sector is like, it's, pardon me, but it's like RFPs in the public sector, it's RFP hell, pardon me. But things like that, in order to be able to actually bring people in to do the work, and again, getting people mobilized within government, it's not always your mandate to be looking at these sort of bigger health issues, right? That was a big issue as well. So if you could actually test some of those concepts and prove your point in the private sector, take it back. I mean, if I was there, I would have listened to it. If you can bring the evidence, right? Evidence says everything. So I would suggest try it out there, test some concepts and collect the data and approach the governments.
And the change we're talking about is not going to be made by the executive table within the Ministry of Health acting on its own. It's going to come from different people, different organizations, many of them private sector, doing things differently right across the health spectrum, and it's going to have to, chip away at the system as a whole. It's why I've talked through a long time about long-term care, because we know that the number of beds on the books even aren't going to be enough. There's going to have to be more private sector involvement. They are going to be more open. They won't be subject to the same kinds of onerous restrictions that broader public service entities are. And they will be driven by a motive that will have them pull innovation in, which is kind of what's missing in the system in the whole. It's a monopoly, right? You don't have to improve your customer offering the same or lower price for survival. You just don't. But the other thing that's happening is, which goes to the private sector point, is the companies that are now in health that weren't before. It's Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, right? On and on it goes. And we're on the cusp of people having more personal health information on their wrists or on their phone than any health institution will have. And they'll have access to diagnostic and treatment information online. May not be, the best healthcare, but it's going to be healthcare. And the opportunities that all that present as people realize they have to, they're going to want to pay out of pocket. It's not even have to, it's a consumer-oriented focus. They're going to want to pay out of pocket. That, to me, is the big commercial opportunity going forward. And it's going to be inevitable that those pressures will come back on the public system, and the public system is going to have to respond, we're not going to have a publicly funded health system in 20 years.
Yeah.
Excellent point. Question over here.
So it's funny, I asked this question, and so you just went on almost answering it. So this morning, there's a statement made about alternative service delivery, right, and the role of the private sector in that, and the fact that this government may actually be receptive to such a thing. And so I was wondering from the panel if you can have maybe there's some examples of like low-hanging fruit of such a thing that we can start seeing that kind of edge of the wedge happening and actually do, right, again, as Jason said this morning.
I would be happy to, because I actually had a company in meeting me, and so maybe I'll just offer this as an idea. It was a U.S. company, and they were in the wound care specific to diabetes, foot ulcers. Now, it was in my current capacity, so I didn't have the authority to make big decisions for lots of Ontarians. But I just want to offer it as an example, because I found it incredibly compelling. And I won't remember the exact numbers, but diabetes, non-compliance, so adherence, right, which everyone in this room, I think, is sensitive to non-adherence, right? You start here, and we see the data, it plummets. So non-adherence, right, leads to complications, leads to foot ulcers, not well treated leads to amputation. Right now, factor in all of the healthcare costs for that. And this particular organization had a very well mapped out business case with respect to if you don't, right, and it was about wound care in their case, as opposed to, drugs or whatever. But, it was kind of that kind of care. But the compelling and the business case in terms of healthcare costs was really, I would say, again, if I were back in my government role, I would have found it incredibly compelling and something that was really tangible to be able to, okay, so how can we address that? So for what it's worth, there's an example that I thought was a good example.
Great. Question over here.
So one of the challenges that we seem to have in Canada and in Ontario is we can't look around the world and apply best practices. Things are happening elsewhere. You look at UK integrated care, the things that they're doing, procurement in Europe. What do you think limits us in terms of being able to take some of the solutions to our problems that are happening elsewhere and actually applying them here?
I wish my colleagues would be able to meet, I wish my colleagues would have been able to, no, that's not even right language. I wish my colleagues would have chosen to meet with industry in the same way that I did, because that's how you get inspired. And I look, these are, as Helen said, like, these are capable people. This is not a personal comment on anyone. It's an organizational comment that for whatever reason, and part of it is workload, part of it are things like restrictions on travel, part of it is there's all sorts of different components. But in our shop, in our OCHIS, we were able to just meet companies all the time. And as a result, we heard from multinationals or smaller companies about what was happening in the rest of the world. And that, it's like, you know, those great pharma meetings, those of you in pharma, where you hear your scientists telling you about, you know, what's happening. And you can't help but be inspired by that stuff. And I honestly think more than anything else, that's the challenge. And I could speculate as to why it's that way, but I don't think I want to. I just wish that they would do what we did. They don't even have to do as much as we did. I just wish that they would do that.
Okay. I think I'm going to have to, there's 4 hands going up. So, Jason, I'm calling on you and Brian to let me know when to stop. There's a hand over here.
Thanks, Brian. Bill, that's a great comment, but I think it also extends to the rest of the panel, and it's been a really super panel, and that is that, okay, this is a policy gathering. How do we change that policy? How do we implement that policy? How does LSO, as a group, get the word out? We heard that RFPs are in the way. We heard that past policies have been in the way. How do we get maybe a session whereby chief people, key people from the government are required to meet with industry and small companies and medium companies? How do we do it?
We need to meet, I guess. We need to organize, probably. I mean, what I would think is, there are lots of experiences, as you said, in the world. There are very good best practices and bad practices. And I think we have to find a platform to really openly discuss about it very transparently, I mean, in a very integrated way. I don't know if we have that type of platform in Canada yet, but I think there is an intention. Everybody would like to do better. So this is an important thing. And the other thing, this is such a capable country. There are lots of investments, such a talent. I mean, very well-educated people, incredible science, very early stage, you know, R&D or activities. So there are lots of, so we have to find a way. I don't know the answer, but I really think that we have to find a way to bring all these things together: expertise, experience, countries, capabilities, and the government. Because if there is no strategy, it really doesn't work. I think it is, you need a strategy, a vision to make it happen. And whose responsibility? I don't know. I cannot comment right now, I guess.
This guy's,
So
this guy's
in case I'm not in enough trouble already, let me try this. Because I've said to many, looking at the faces, I've said this to many of you in the room at some point over the last, frankly, 10 years, those of you from pharma in particular, to be really honest. Okay, so people in the government are, for whatever reason, kind of choosing not to meet with industry. Like, kind of all else remaining equal, they'll choose not to remain there. Now, part of it is they've consciously chosen government, not industry, and there's lots of values that underlie that, right? But we know that about our customer in this case, or our, let's call them stakeholders, right? We know that they're kind of predisposed generally not to want to meet with industry, us, let's say. Okay, so we get good advice on come with solutions, address priority, like do that kind of stuff, right? So be part of the solution, not the problem. But here's another thing that happens. There's bad behavior. There's bad behavior, right? And many of you heard me say that I consciously said when I took that job over, I was not going to do biopharmaceuticals. And I didn't want to do biopharmaceuticals because, you know what? I don't know how many times out of 10, but more than 5 or 6, those meetings turn into browbeatings of price and access. And I'll tell you, I didn't want to do a meeting, and I kind of got a bit snookered into it with 3 pharma CEOs, and I'm not going to name them, and I'll be darned, this was like 2 months before I left the job. I'll be darned if they didn't beat me up on price and access. And Suzanne McGurn, who was the drug plan manager, Helen's role, she was right behind me. Like, she was meeting literally in the next slot after I was. And I could not believe that, because these people knew what I did. I couldn't have been more clear that I didn't do that, and they couldn't help themselves. And as you all know, there's an apocryphal story floating around about Simon Kennedy in a meeting he had with pharma CEOs in the last 6 months. Same thing. Despite the best efforts of people to keep CEOs on task, there's one person in the room, as I understand it, couldn't help themselves, and off they went. So would you want to meet with that group of people? I mean, honestly. So there's a bit of like, wake up, please. And I understand, like, I'm not naive. I was in there for 10 years. I get that the general managers in Canada are often simply answering to those to whom they report, usually reside in a different country, and usually are just telling, right? And you got 2 years here, and you want to get your job done, you want to hit your numbers, and you want to be successful. That's terrific. Like, it's not a bad thing. But then don't wonder aloud why the meetings aren't working. It's really quite extraordinary. And this has been a decade that I've been in and around pharma. Now, here's examples of things that do work. There are companies, and I'll give a shout out to Medtronic, because Omar, their global CEO, is a true thought leader in the area of value-based care. And they legitimately, again, I'm not naive, I understand the commercial purpose behind it, but there are meetings that they have with senior people globally where they're literally educating people on the other side of the table on value-based care. Now, their business bet is the more you believe in value-based care, and of course you hear more about Medtronic in the process, that you're going to be predisposed to, whatever with Medtronic in the future. But that's a different meeting. And again, there's different ways to do these things, and that's where I'm now probably in trouble. But, with this room, but we have, pronouns you or we or whatever, as a system, we have to get better at that. Because if you don't have those meetings with people who are predisposed not to meet with you, it goes back to the question. It's hard for them to learn what's happening elsewhere in the world. I'm not absolving them. Hopefully you don't hear that. But it's just, that's not the way the dynamic should work. We should have an environment in which people want to meet with other people, not agree all the time. I've said this about Helen. She knows I say this. Like, when I met Helen early on, we didn't agree on a number of things we didn't agree on when I was at AstraZeneca. But she was awesome. Awesome, right? You always respected her, her view. They were always well-grounded. That is how things are supposed to work. We learned a ton from Helen in the way she was doing things. And remember, she was the first one, right? So we got to get there, because the system will not be better than the sum of its parts unless we get to a place where people are having those conversations with each other.
Wait, can I just sort of offer you one sentence? Because this is what I know, right, in bringing forward proposals to government, I would suggest sort of you take the lens of what does this mean to Ontarians? And it doesn't need to be, it can be the patients, right, in terms of better health. It can be to the system in terms of more efficient healthcare delivery. It can be to the, to the economic development, for instance, of the province. And so I would just, whatever you do bring forward, put that lens on it. What does it mean to Ontarians? Because I know certainly from bringing lots of things to cabinet, that resonates. I mean, they're political, right? They're there to deliver on a mandate to the people that elected them. So just, that was longer than one sentence. But keep that in mind when you bring something forward. Just put that lens on it. What does it mean to Ontarians?
That's great. That's probably a good way to end. I had promised this gentleman one quick one, but maybe we should defer that for the break, if you don't mind. Grab these guys after you. I'll